Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Tomorrow, the eyes of the world will turn to the Sinai, to Sharm el-Sheikh, where Israeli, American, Egyptian, Qatari, and Hamas officials will gather for what could be the most consequential round of talks since this war began nearly 2 years ago with the Hamas invasion on October 7th. On the table is President Donald Trump's 20-point plan to end the war in Gaza, a plan that will decide the fate of the hostages, the future of Gaza, and Israel's long-term security. To break it all down, I sit down today with Ambassador Dennis Ross, a co-chair of JPPI and one of the most seasoned Middle East negotiators over the last half-century. We speak about the stakes ahead of the meeting tomorrow, the chances that this plan can actually work, the risks if it fails, and who stands to emerge as the real winners and losers. This is a conversation about diplomacy, power, peace, the potential return home of the hostages, and a moment that could reshape the entire Middle East. Stay with us. Dennis, it's great to have you with us as always. And we are really, it's tough to know exactly what's going to happen. We're talking Sunday, October 5th. It's about 4:20 in the afternoon here in Jerusalem. We're hearing lots of rumbles from Donald Trump and Marco Rubio and Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas and the talks that are going to take place in Sharm. Before we kind of get into predictions and ask you to look at your crystal ball of what will happen, I do think it's interesting to look at, though, for a moment, how did we get to this point where suddenly Donald Trump lays down the law as to some extent, and everybody is falling in line, right? Which is something that this could have not happened earlier.
Well, I think the answer is it could have happened earlier. Donald Trump has enormous leverage on Prime Minister Netanyahu. He had it before. He ordered the strikes against Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. But especially after that, there is no way that the Prime Minister was going to say no to him. This is the same president who basically said, you turn those planes around.
Right.
When they were like a minute outside of Iranian airspace. We're talking about 50 planes. They turned around. He could not say no to him. The interesting question was, why was it not important enough to Trump to exercise that leverage before? I think there's no obvious answer to that, because people have asked me many times, when did I think there would be a sell-by date for Trump when it came to the war? And I would have thought it would have come sooner, because he has emphasized how he's a peacemaker and he was going to bring this to an end. I suspect the key turning point were all of his discussions with the Arabs. Mm-hmm. The meeting that he had in New York seems to have been decisive, but obviously there was work being done in advance of that. I know from the time when I was in Israel a little over a month ago that at that point there were pretty advanced discussions going on a plan for day after. These reflected basically what Tony Blair has been doing for well over a year. They had involved Ron Dermer. They had involved the Emiratis. They had increasingly involved the Qataris and the Saudis. So all this had been in train. And I think the key turning point, maybe the president was looking at New York, looking at UNGA, knowing when he was going to meet everybody. And this was going to be the point where this would come to a decision. The Arabs came in the meeting and they were very clear. I can tell you for a couple of weeks in advance, I know from my own conversations, they were making clear they were going to be very direct with the president on the issue of no annexation in the West Bank. You'll recall that Bibi said he wouldn't make any decisions on that prior to seeing Trump. And there was a lot of pressure building up from within his own base. I'm not even talking about
the settler leaders came with him to Washington, right? They accompanied him.
Right. So this was an expectation they were going to move on that. He heard from the Arabs as a group and even individually prior to that time. So he tells them there'll be no annexation. And then he says the next day there'll be no annexation. But at the same time, this is all tied up with we got to bring the war in Gaza to an end. I will say one thing that seems to have affected him quite a bit are the meetings with the hostage families. And also he seems to have paid a lot of attention to the protests. It's quite interesting to me that, I guess about a month ago, 500,000 people turned out in Tel Aviv and around the country, and he seems to have paid attention to that. So I can't give you an answer with high confidence because I might lack the humility I should have when it comes to predicting things in the Middle East, but I'm extremely humble when it comes to predicting President Trump.
But what's interesting though, when you think about it, is Donald Trump, to some extent, has always been in favor of a Palestinian state, right? He said it before the elections when he was first elected in 2016. He said it when his plan, Peace to Prosperity, included the establishment of a Palestinian state. The Israeli people, though, it's interesting, and I've been thinking a lot about this. What is it that we don't understand that everybody keeps talking about? Even this guy talks about the Palestinian state. But I think part of the problem is that in February, when the prime minister went to see him, Trump drops this bombshell, the Gaza Riviera, right? Now, had he back then said, listen, we all know where we're going. Let's get on board. We're going to end up here. Because you and I have spoken about this over the last 2 years. Everybody pretty much knew this war is going to end with a new entity in Gaza. It's going to be in charge of the place. It's not going to include Hamas. Will it include the PA? Will it not include a PA? Okay, that's kind of where things get a little complicated. But that's known, right? No one thought it was going to be anything else. But this whole Gaza Riviera thing that he dropped back in February, did that not waste some precious time here?
I think it did. And I said at the time, I think we may even had a discussion on this, that this was not a well thought out political plan. This was an approach of two people who've done a lot of real estate development. Steve Witkoff, who flew over Gaza and said, boy, the place is devastated. How are you going to rebuild it with 2 million people there? Let's clear it out. And then we can do our version of urban renewal. And I think that it was an idea that caught Trump's fancy. And he said, yeah, we can turn that. It's got all sorts of beachfront. We can turn it into something. And how are you going to rebuild with 2 million people there? The Egyptians came up with a plan that I said at the time was half a plan, because they described an approach that allowed you to rebuild Gaza without displacing the population. Some could leave voluntarily, but the vast majority would stay. But they didn't come with a security plan. They came only with basically a reconstruction rehabilitation plan. I can tell you at the time, the Saudis were keeping their distance from the Egyptian plan because they said, you haven't produced the security side of this.
Right.
One of the interesting things is the key Arabs who will play a role in what comes next in Gaza, meaning the Emiratis and the Saudis, have never wanted Hamas to emerge from this in a position where it retained any control whatsoever. And they always made it clear there's no money they're putting into Gaza if Hamas is still there running things. So you had a fundamental convergence of interest when it comes to, okay, what should the future of Gaza look like? Different attitudes about how you get there, the steps you have to take, but no difference on the fundamental goals. Qatar later on comes around mostly. I wouldn't say completely, but mostly. But now I think Qatar has also played a huge role in terms of influencing President Trump. I also think they played a huge role. I think they shaped the Hamas response to the Trump plan. This was a very smartly conceived response that focused on what mattered most to Trump. What mattered most to Trump was the hostages.
Right.
That would be the symbol of his success. That was the symbol that he was producing. And they also said, and they also signed up to, yeah, we accept a technocratic government. They signed up to nothing else. But for Trump, they're being responsive.
Yeah, but those are also those 2 points. Yeah, those 2 points that you mentioned are also the most immediate and the most tangible that you can show, right? Hostages come home and new government that doesn't include them is established. Does the one thing you didn't mention, and I'm curious of the role this might have played in it, there have been some reports of the impact that the Israeli strike on September 8th, I think it was in Doha, against Hamas there, and I guess the recklessness that maybe some in Washington viewed that attack. And by the way, we've seen since then how the Qataris have now been upgraded with their status and this new executive order that basically says the United States will allocate all resources or something like that to defend Qatar from any type of foreign attack in the future. And I actually read somewhere over the weekend here in Israel in one of the papers over Shabbat that that only two countries have ever attacked Qatar, Iran and Israel. So basically, we're being put in the same pool as the Iranians that America will have to defend the Qataris from. But how much of a role do you think that played? The fact that it didn't succeed, that it didn't go off well, and obviously the Qataris were very upset. We saw that photo of Trump holding the receiver with Bibi on the phone. I mean, wow, that's one for the history books. I mean, how much do you think that played a role here?
Hugely.
Hugely.
Look, I don't know whether Bibi had a conversation with Trump prior to doing that. It seems remarkable that he would not have. But we know one thing about President Trump. If you're successful, that's great.
Right.
And he'll align with you. If you fail, he will create no connection to your failure. And if anything, he went out of his way in the aftermath of what clearly failed to basically become much closer to Qatar. What you're saying, he's given Qatar a get out of jail free card. This is the commitment he's making, the executive order he signed. This looks stronger than NATO today. If you ask NATO countries, are they confident that the president's going to come to their assistance? By the way, this one says we will come to their assistance, including militarily.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, tended to bind Qatar with the United States much more strongly. But it also means that Qatar has a fair amount of influence. And I come back to why the president was so quick to embrace the Hamas response. I'm quite sure it was certainly transmitted by Qatar. The best possible interpretation of it was obviously provided by Qatar. And it was designed to appeal, and you put it well, to the most tangible, immediate achievements. And when I say that, I'm not trying to minimize it.
Yeah.
I think, by the way, it is important. Getting the hostage release should have been the major preoccupation all along.
So let's talk about the plan for a moment. And I think, we all share this hope and prayer that this is going to happen. And there's the talks that are going to be taking place on Monday in Sharm, and hopefully they will lead to a resolution and some sort of agreement. But based on what we know in this so-called 20-point plan, I mean, when you look at the overall, and to me, it seems that Israel walks away pretty good here, right? We have a new government in Gaza, not including Hamas. Hamas is disarmed. Yes, some of the guys get amnesty. That's true. There's a prisoner release that we're going to empty out the prisons here of all the top bad guys, which is never a good thing, but we're getting back the 48 hostages. There was always going to be a price there, and it's less than the Shalit deal. But probably more importantly is the perimeter that Israel's able to keep in Gaza based on these maps that keep coming out, and seems to show that Israel's going to keep some sort of position on the Philadelphia corridor, which is that piece of land or that strip where Hamas historically smuggled its weapons. So I mean, you've dealt with maps before a lot. You've drawn maps yourself, and you've been in a lot of these negotiations. When you look at the sum of it all, is this an Israeli win?
If it gets implemented. Look, you read the 20 points. There's a lot in there that is very positive for Israel. By the way, be clear, Israel does withdraw completely. There is a perimeter kept for a period of time until such time as Gaza no longer presents a terror threat.
Right, which who knows when that is, right?
Who knows? Who defines it?
Right.
But there is complete Israeli withdrawal. It does come in phases. If Hamas is disarmed, again, what's the practical means for doing this? If you look at the 21 points that were presented to the Arabs, and then the 20 points that emerged after subsequent discussions between Dermer and Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the greatest area of a higher level of specificity relates specifically to the disarming. Disarming as an outcome was in the 21 points, but it's very vague as to when that takes place. Certainly how it takes place is left completely open-ended. It's more specific in the 20 points. I mean, there is monitoring that's supposed to go on. There are timelines that are supposed to be part of this. The devil here is in the details, to say the least. If this gets implemented the way it should, it is very favorable to Israel. But let's take a step back. What I said before, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates were never going to invest in Gaza if Hamas is not disarmed. I have said for a long time, the formula is demilitarization for reconstruction. And I say it's not an argument, it's a fact. No one invests in Gaza if Hamas has not been disarmed, if there isn't demilitarization, if they can reconstitute themselves, because they will do it all over again. So it's not like this was an Israeli objective that nobody else shared. It's an objective that is a collective objective, at least of the leading Arab states, precisely because it's the only way that Gaza can be rebuilt. So I do think we have a strong convergence at that level, and that clearly is important.
What do you understand? I mean, there was one of the clauses there, one of the points is also the de-radicalization. Right now, again, doesn't really go into any detail of what that means. Is UNRWA still involved? Is UNRWA not involved? Who's going to be doing the education? Are there new textbooks? Are there not? I mean, there's so many pieces to this. How important is de-radicalization for the future?
Again, I don't think it's just an Israeli objective. It should be an indisputable Israeli objective for sure. But for anybody who wants to see a reconstruction of Gaza, and again, who are the countries that are going to put the money in? Okay, Qatar I put in one category, but the Emirates and the Saudis have been prepared to be quite serious about it. But they have no interest if there isn't disarming, and they have no interest if there isn't a change fundamentally in the radicalization of Gaza. They are not about the Muslim Brotherhood. And the last thing they want to see is a radicalized Gaza remain, because that ensures this problem doesn't go away. And Yaakov, here I think is the bigger issue. What is the big opportunity here is that for the first time in the history of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, there are Arab states who are prepared to assume a level of responsibility for Palestinians. They have never done that in the past. They've treated the issue as a slogan. I used to say one of the reasons we couldn't get the Arabs to play the role we wanted to in the year 2000 was no one on the Arab side was prepared to have Arafat stand up and say, but they're trying to get me to forsake and betray the Palestinian national cause. There is no Palestinian leader today who could stand up and say that and have any credibility or following. Number one. Number two, you have the Gulf states in particular who realize they can't ignore the issue, which they thought they could for a while. And they realized, given their objectives, which are all about being leaders in AI, in being leaders in digital economy, in being leaders in alternative energy sources, not just in the region, but internationally. And they need the Palestinian issue to be, I'll say, managed in a way that it can no longer absorb them, distract them. So they have a stake that they've never had before, and that's new. And it's always been the case that if we didn't have the Arabs playing a role where they could do more to affect Palestinian behavior, we were unlikely to get to where we want to go. Now, we also have a reality that has always been the case. The U.S. has always been the only party that could affect Israel.
Right.
The great irony is we're seeing President Trump has a capacity that previous presidents haven't had. And I would say that's true with regard to Prime Minister Netanyahu, because with any Democratic president, he could always turn to the Republicans and know that they would support him against the Democrats and create this as a political wedge issue. He doesn't have that option. He can't turn to the Republicans. He turns to the Republicans, they will back Trump, they won't back him. So that's why Trump has so much leverage, in addition to the fact that because he acted in Iran and because he's been generally supportive of Israel, very hard to say no to him. And in any case, we now have clear demonstrations. And I talked about the planes turning around Iran, but the clearest demonstration is what you said. The phone call where the prime minister apologizes. Compare what he says in the phone call with what he was saying publicly after the strike.
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, it's unbelievable. But I'm also curious. I mean, listen, Trump has limited attention span also, right? And now he's very invested. And if this ends and there's a deal, he kind of moves away. But you still have those Arab countries, as you said, which is very interesting, that are taking that level of responsibility like never before. But the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, Turkey's getting involved here. The Qataris are also involved. It seems to me that to some extent you have kind of also a bit of a battle here in the Middle East or in the region between some opposing forces on the Muslim Arab side. Do you see that also kind of as these two different, one's pulling one way, one's pulling the other way?
I do. I mean, we have a stake in how that competition comes out. We have those Arabs who realize need this issue to go away. We have those Arab leaders who identify with the Muslim Brotherhood and for whom managing the conflict, meaning sustaining the conflict as opposed to ending it or managing it in a way where over time it's going to go away. Their attitude is different. Their attitude, I mean, I've never thought of it this way before, but it might be a little bit like the way the Soviet Union used to operate towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. Keep it bubbling, but don't let it ever spill over.
Mm-hmm.
They have no interest in there being a war. They do have an interest in using it as an issue of some leverage.
Dennis, I'm curious, this deal or this plan that we mentioned before, you definitely could have written this a year and a half ago. By the way, Tony Blinken wrote it over, basically a year and a half ago. The former Secretary of State. And I was looking back at his speech to the Atlantic Council in January, just a few days before stepping down. And it's almost 1-to-1, essentially, of what we're now seeing. There's different little nuances. And of course, January isn't now. And who knows if Hamas back then would have given up all the hostages. It was before the deal that went into effect. So there's a lot of unknowns. But I am curious, one of the problems that Israel faces, and this is, I think, also contributes to the leverage that Donald Trump has over Bibi, is Israel today is very isolated, hyper isolated, like never before on the world stage. I mean, all our friends have turned on us to some extent with the recognition of a Palestinian state and more. Trump is the only guy that Bibi can actually lean on today. It's not Keir Starmer and it's not Emmanuel Macron, right? It's only Donald Trump, and Trump knows that. So he's going to use that leverage that he has over Bibi. But Absolutely. I'm curious that if Israel had a year and a half ago, let's say, so we had, let's say, half a year of sympathy from the world after October 7th, do what you got to do, fight how you got to fight. But then as things started to obviously decline a few months in, Israel had come out and said, listen, we have a plan. We want to remove Hamas as the governing entity, degrade it militarily, establish a new mechanism. It's going to include a member of the Palestinian Authority. We don't yet know who. We're going to have that conversation. And then we're going to get on track and have conversations about a long-term political process and resolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We never had that. Instead, what did we have? A vacuum, which was filled by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who talked about resettling the Gaza Strip or, occupying forever the Gaza Strip. How much, as a real veteran diplomat who knows how this stuff works, how much of us being Israel not articulating a day after plan, how much did that contribute to the diplomatic isolation of the country?
Hugely, for sure. Because if you had been able to point to a day after plan, and then it would have been Hamas that would have been the obstacle to it, then everything is different. The value of the sequence, the way this was done, and by the way, this was what Blinken was planning in the fall. There was going to be, the whole idea was to lay out this plan. You had the Arabs and the Europeans signing up to it in advance of unveiling it, and then you had a conference where it was embraced. The whole idea was if Hamas you put pressure on Hamas, so either it says yes or all the onus is on it as opposed to Israel. So you didn't have the day after plan. But I would say there was a bigger strategic mistake that was made. That was on the issue of humanitarian assistance. From the very beginning, if Israel wanted time and space to do what was necessary militarily against Hamas, it had to show that it was doing all it could to ensure humanitarian assistance was going into Gaza. Exactly the opposite was done. Everything was done only in the most resistant, the most reluctant, hesitant way. It was always done piecemeal. Now, to be fair, what Israel should have said, we're going to do this because this is not against the Palestinians who live in Gaza, it's against Hamas, and Hamas is trying to use them all as human shields, but we're going to do what we can, A, to ensure they get humanitarian assistance. We also call on the United States, which wants us to do this, to come up with a means to distribute it so that Hamas can't benefit from it. There is a mistake that was made on our side and the internet, and I would say the European side. You call for humanitarian assistance, but you assume no responsibility for its delivery. That was wrong. So Israel did not approach this from a strategic standpoint. It needed time and space to do what it did militarily, and it had to act militarily, and it had to weaken Hamas so it couldn't be a military any longer, but it also needed to create a context in which it was doing it, and it did not do that.
And it's not do that, and I think that's partially of what brought us to where we are today. If you had to guess, and again, I don't want to put you necessarily on the spot, but Trump's leverage here and his influence, that's going to play out at Sharm. He's sending Witkoff, he's sending Jared Kushner there. Are you optimistic overall when you think about what's coming?
I use the term hopeful instead of optimism.
Okay.
Optimism is a sentiment that believes things will always work out. And I know nothing ever works out on its own. Hope is different because hope is related to possibility. I see a possibility now. I do see in the near term, I think there is a very good chance that we can see the hostages released. Because here I think that you do have Turkey and Qatar working on Hamas. My own reading, because I do talk to Palestinians who still have access within Gaza, it is the internal Hamas that actually is more willing to do a deal. It is the external Hamas that is the more resistant, but they're also the ones susceptible to pressure from Turkey and Qatar. So I think this getting the hostages released, I think the hostages being released, I'm much more hopeful about that. Getting the whole plan implemented is going to be really hard, and it's going to take a team on the U.S. side. And Blair has a team. It's going to take a determined effort with teams of specialists to be able to sort out all of the details over time. That's more problematic. I still think there's a degree of hope. We're in a very different place than we were. So I'm hopeful about the near term, a little bit, I think, less hopeful about the longer term, but still think we're in a different place that has possibility, and we have to live for possibility and promote it.
Okay, I will grab your hope, Dennis, because I think we all need it. Let me thank you so much for joining me today and just sharing your insights about where we're headed and hopefully what will happen. Thank you.
Yaakov, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Please go to Apple, Spotify, or everywhere else you get your podcast. Give us 5 stars. It would mean a lot. And share with your friends. Have a great Sukkot holiday that is coming tomorrow night on Monday night. And we'll be back probably later this week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week, a great holiday. And like Dennis and I said, let's all remain hopeful that this deal is going to be accepted, is going to work, and this war will finally be over. Thank you.